Spend management is basically controlling the dollars flowing out the door of your organization, right? So when it comes to your spend, okay, there's first one that is obvious for an organization is the payroll, but this one, typically you're pretty much in control of it, right? So here we're talking about the rest of the spend, which basically is related to purchase orders, invoices that are coming into your organization, but that are not related to orders. So you don't really know about this until it arrives in your organization. We're talking also about any spend that goes on corporate cards, typically your employees, some of your employees that might be traveling and so on. That could be anything related also to cash or out-of-pocket reimbursements. Anything travel related, travel cost. Maybe you're using cash advances or petty cash, right? So we're talking about all that spend, okay? So now I'd like to take you through a kind of a scenario there, right? Okay, so it's the end of November. I've got a department manager in my organization. So let's say I'm an accountant, and this person comes to see me saying, "Hey, I'd like to take my team out for Christmas lunch. I think the cost will be around $1,000." He comes and see me. You know, I'm the accountant. I've got the truth and the source of all the data there. So do I have the budget? I will run a cost report. And typically that's what you see. That's an example there, right? I've got the actual. This is typically telling me this is what I've spent so far against my budget, and I can have the variance. So here, you know, looks like, okay, I've spent so far 370,000 out of my budget of 420. Looks like I've got 50,000 left. So typically when I'm in a room there in front of an audience, you know, I like to see and ask a question about and get people raise their hand, you know, asking, okay, what do you think there? Do we have the budget? Or who thinks we don't have the budget, or some might not know, and so on. And I typically see a lot of different variation there in terms of who raises the hand there. Before I move to the next slide, I like actually to give you a bit of a story there, a personal story, to illustrate this typical situation there, right? And it's a personal one, you know, that was the end of last month, end of January, comes the 30th of January. So I don't have an accounting system myself, but I keep, you know, an Excel spreadsheet with some of my budget, personal budget, you know, come to the 30th of the month, looks like in going through my expenses, I spent, I paid my rent, paid, you know, all the phone, internet bills and so on, the major bills and so on, even my car, I've got a repair that was covered and so on. It looks like I've got a bit of a budget left there. And my wife and I decided, hey, you know, let's go out on a good have a good meal and so on. And so we went to a nice restaurant, and even, you know, we said, hey, you know, French background, obviously, I like wine, so hey, let's spend a bit more on a nice bottle of wine there. So very happy and so on, all within budget, all good. Come the next day, 31st and so on. Well, surprise, my daughter comes and so on, says, hey, Dad, forgot to tell you, yesterday I was shopping with my friend, and it looks like, you know, there was sales going on, and I had this great pair of shoes that was on sale, and yeah, I didn't have any money. I couldn't pay myself, so my friend's mom, you know, was agreed to pay for it. So, oh, good news! I've got her bank details and so on. Can you transfer some like $150 to her account, please, and so on? Oh, wow. Different story there, right? I don't have, my budget is not looking so great anymore and so on, right? So why? Typically, I didn't know about this cost. I was not aware about this cost until the last day of the month, until the very last minute. So, and typically that illustrates what happens in a company, okay? If I look at my ERP system doesn't know about many things in my organization. It doesn't know about some invoices that might come into my organization that are sitting on an employee's desk waiting for approval. It doesn't know also about some POs that have or purchase requests that have been initiated by some employees that have not been submitted yet, okay? It doesn't know about credit card charges. Typically, process we see in companies, at the very end of the month or beginning of the next month, this is where you will get the statement from the bank. This is where you know how much you're going to be direct debited from the bank for all the charges that went on those credit cards. And what about travel bookings? Some companies might have gone and booked their travel and so on, and you're not aware of that yet. And not talking about cash expenses, the receipts that are outstanding, waiting somewhere in a wallet, and you don't know about, okay? Well, basically there's a root cause for that, and it's a fair one, ERP systems do not capture data when an action actually happens. It's an important reason because it misses on this information because of an accounting system can't recognize cost until accounting rules are met, okay? There's been very high-profile companies that have collapsed. Talking about, we've all heard about Enron, but locally, OneTel, Dick Smith, have faced difficulties. So all that has led to more stringent controls and implementation of standards like IFRS or SOX to get more control about how you need to account for cost in your systems. So this is why we see typically on some invoices, for example, coming into your organization, we see typically 1, 2, 3 levels of managers or people who have the authority to approve costs based on dollar limits, for example, and who have to sign off on the cost before it is accounted for into the ERP. We're not saying it's wrong, it's perfectly right, but this makes it difficult for a cost manager to have visibility and to control the spend. I'd like to introduce Concur, obviously, but what Concur has built is an ecosystem to capture the spend as data as it happens, right? And what I'd like to do through the next slide, and actually I'll run also a quick demo, is to take you through those different modules that Concur has built in order to control this spend, okay, into your organization, and how we capture this data as it happens. Okay. First things around expense. I spoke about those receipts, that are, waiting in a wallet somewhere and you don't know about, or those credit cards, that employees use and you're only aware of the spend at the end of the month when the statement comes, right? So what Concur does there? Well, typically as a user, all I have to do is take a picture of my receipt, okay? And what happens there, as soon as I take a picture of my receipt with my mobile app, Concur will read and extract the key information out of that receipt. So the vendor information, the dollar amount, and so on. It saves the image, and then it will route this to my Concur profile in Concur, to my user profile. And it's either I've paid with cash out of pocket, or with my personal credit card. It doesn't matter. I know about this spend because of the data I captured on the receipt. But if I spend on my credit card, what we do as well is that about 24 hours to 48 hours after I spend on my credit card, I've got a card feed coming in Concur as well on my user profile, which means then I can match also my receipt with my credit card. And I start to have my expense claim that starts to write by itself, okay? So typically as I travel, all I have to do, I'm given my receipt, I open my app, take a photo, and that's it, and put my phone back into my pocket and go on with my day, right? So that's on the expense side of things, where typically from the beginning of the month, you are in control about that spend, okay? Now, talking about the invoices, I took this example with my daughter because that illustrates very well what happens when you have a non-purchase order related invoice that comes into your organization. I've had many meetings with customers in my life where typically AP comes to be aware of an invoice last day of the month after it has been sitting for a few weeks into the organization, flying from desk to desk, and then it comes the time where you have to pay straight away. So what happens with Concur is that as soon as supplier gets their invoice ready in their system, we ask them to send an email because 1 minute after it's in your system and actually it's in Concur. And from here, you know that there is an invoice coming from this supplier. You're aware of it. You can even inform this supplier that you've received their invoice. They don't have to call you anymore and you know, waste your time with those inquiries because you can tell them, hey, check on your portal, we'll tell you if we've received your invoice. What happens as soon as we receive this invoice, we'll run an OCR engine to extract the data, and we'll make this invoice ready into your organization for, if it's a non-PO invoice, you probably need to code this to a cost center or projects and so on. If it's related to a purchase order, Concur will run matching rules against the purchase order and potentially also against a good receipt. Typically what we call a two-way matching process or a three-way matching process, right? And if it has to be workflowed into your organization for approval or for review and so on, that could be done, and an employee or a manager or up to the CFO, depending on your delegation of authority, can use their mobile phone there as they're traveling to review this invoice and approve it on the go. Okay, so once this process has happened and so on, the data is ready to be integrated into your ERP system, and the invoice can be archived in Concur. Obviously, at that point, you will, you know, depending on your payment terms, you will trigger the payment to your supplier. You can do this through your ERP, as most organizations do. You can also look at solutions that Concur provide around payment, right? For example, paying with a credit card and giving you extra, you know, cash flow and working capital there, right? So this is typically the process. That what is important there is, as soon as you get the email from your supplier, you're in control of this invoice. You can control that spend. You can report on it, and you know what your liabilities and your accruals there, right? What I'd like to do there, I'm going to jump out of this presentation just for a few seconds. What I'd like to do is to actually take you to a live demonstration of the invoice, spend a bit more time on this, right? So I'm going to display the Concur platform here. So what you see is the web interface. So we're a cloud application. All you need is basically a browser, or you can use the Concur app, obviously, as I said, on your mobile. And here, typically, I'm logged with a user where you can see, as we spoke about, travel, expenses, invoice. And if I typically focus on invoice, as a user, as I mentioned, suppliers would send their email. They would be coming and run through our optical character recognition engine, where data would be extracted. And here, what I'm going to show you is a verification step. So I've got an invoice, for example, from a legal firm coming. It's ready for verification. So here, this step is typically verifying the data that has been extracted okay. Everywhere I've got light blue text on the right-hand side on my invoice is where our OCR engine has detected some text. And then I can see on the left-hand side, we pre-populated the form. So we already recognize the supplier there on the legal firm. I recognize the invoice number. If I click on this field, I can see it's highlighted on yellow on the right-hand side. I can see my invoice date now. I've captured my key header information, my amount, and so on. And I've captured my line item details, right, of my invoice. Okay, if I need to capture some extract field, like my bank account number, I can go ahead, go on the field, highlight it, and click, and it will be automatically now populated on the left-hand side. Okay. We can default GL counts based on the supplier, for example, which should be your expense type GL code. And then we can assign to a user in your organization, because this person typically has a non-PO invoice, will have to review and code this invoice. Okay. And if I submit this invoice, this is where we can start the process of routing this throughout your organization. So no more paper, no more invoices going onto the desk, right? This user will be notified of an email, by an email, that an invoice is ready for him to review. And here, you know, when this user logs in, like what you see on my screen, he will see this invoice coming at the very end of my list there, and he will be able to review this invoice. At that stage, we can run some check and audit rules. For example, you've seen me extracting this bank account number out of the invoice. So I can, for example, verify this against my supplier master data. And here, if I look at my supplier on this one, on this example, I don't have an account number against this supplier. So here I'm alerted, hey, now there's a bank account. So you might want to check with your supplier. Maybe now they provide their bank account and are happy to be paid through EFT payment. Or maybe that's a fraudulent invoice that you want to double check and so on, but at least you've got the information there, right? I can view my invoice, obviously. I can display it, I can pop it so that I can see it directly in full, okay? And automatically, we can set up rules as well. Here, because I'm a user, for example, of a particular entity, I can default the cost center to the user. Or I can go ahead, for example, and select my line and decide to distribute this invoice. And, for example, allocate it. So in my case, on this demo system, for example, it can be allocated to a specific country and a specific department there. Hong Kong advertising. I can also split the cost 50-50 between two cost centers, for example. All right. So this structure of the cost objects will obviously be reflected and depend on each organization, and we would configure this in the system, right? You can save favorite, you can save it as favorite, the way you allocate, and then you can recall those allocations. So for example, here I can keep, if I always allocate an invoice the same, I can use exactly the same allocation each time for this invoice and give it a meaningful name. Once I saved it, obviously there will be a workflow that will be set up in my case for this non-PO after my user. If I look at the detail of my workflow here on my system, it will go to my manager for approval, and potentially here, based on a limit on the dollar value of my invoice, which is set up to $2,000 in my system, might go to the second level approver. Here, because my invoice is less than 2,000, this step will be skipped, and it will go directly to accounts payable for final accounting review. Okay. So as I submit this request, it will basically flow into the system and go to my following approver. Okay. And what I want to show you is actually how this happens on the mobile. So here I'm displaying my mobile phone on the screen. Hope you can all see it. And we've got this Concur application here at the top. And when I open it, so obviously here as a user or as a manager, I can do my own expenses, but I can also have access to anything I have to approve as a user. And under the approval there, if I connect here, I can approve claims, expense claim, for example. We'll talk about purchase request in a minute, but I've got also invoices that I can approve. So the beauty here is that you can also use the same application all the way, and your managers can approve through the same application their expenses, invoices, purchase requests all the way. I can see my invoice came through at the as the last one on the list there. I can already see there's potentially a warning there, which is highlighted with this yellow triangle. And when I open the invoice, I can basically review the details of my supplier, my key information on the header with the invoice number, the date. I can obviously view the line items. I can go into the detail of my line items, see it's been distributed between 3 different allocated cost centers. So here it's been split a third between those 3. Okay. If I come back, obviously at the top I didn't mention, but any exception will be highlighted. Here I didn't, this bank account warning still shows. And I've got access to my image there, right? So if I go directly with my, and enlarge this with my fingers on my phone, I can basically review my invoice as a manager and make sure it is valid. At the bottom, you can see I can send back. As a manager, I could send back to my employee. If I click there, I can put a comment. Maybe it's not been allocated okay, or this the problem that I want to check with this supplier, or I can go ahead and approve, and then it will go ahead and continue the flow of approval. Last thing I want to show you on the invoice side of things, before I jump back into the slides. Typically, you want AP to have full visibility, like, and be in control of this stand. So there's a specific role that exists for finance or AP, which we call the processor role. So here I'm logged with one of those users who have access, and I can access their specific screen, where typically I can search, you know, across a date range, for example. I can search invoices. I can typically search also on a specific criteria. So if I look, for example, for my vendor name that starts with my legal firm, for example, I'll be able to search any invoices of this company there, all right? So I can see those from my vendor legal firm. I can see I've got another vendor as well that starts with the same name there. But I can see in the past I've had invoices, some have been paid, some are still in accounting review, not paid. And here, this is my last invoice. I can also run queries. So any queries, for example, if I want to see any invoices that are still in my, you know, somewhere with an approver that hasn't been approved for more than 5 days, for example, I can run a query, and automatically I'll have the list of those invoices with who is the approver it is with, and then I can basically have action on those. Obviously, there are automatic email reminders that will be sent to those approvers after a certain number of days. There's automatic escalation that can be set, and users can also set delegation, for example, while they're out of the office. On top of this, there's plenty of reports that exist. If I go into the reportings on invoices, for example, one that is typically used a lot is the accruals. So you're coming at some point in the month, you want to look for a certain range from, let's say, this beginning of the year. And here I can basically see all the invoices that are still somewhere in my organization, not approved yet, and showing by different approval status. I can basically have all the list of my invoices, all those that are pending approval, and I can see all my liabilities there. Okay. We also have some dashboards that exist, like this invoice management dashboard, which typically collects information from different reports and aggregate these for, you know, someone running the invoice management. Could be AP, finance. I can see my aging payables, my total invoice spends, my top 10 vendors, and so on. And obviously, you can create additional dashboards and reports. So that was a quick overview on Invoice. I'll come back to the slides. There we go. Running again this. So here we've seen expense, we've seen invoice, how you can control this from, you know, and how Concur can help you capture this data straight as it happens or as it comes into your organization. That's not all right. When talking about controlling spend, also a nice way to before you order or an employee is about to spend some budget from your organization is actually to get some approval up front. So typically what we've done is we've implemented purchase requests. And the idea with Concur, you know, is not to replace some maybe purchase ordering systems that you may have in your ERP today, and that might be linked to your inventory and so on. We're not there to do this because sometimes it's very well run and obviously it's done for a purpose from the ERP. But if you haven't implemented yet purchasing or procurement process through purchase request, or if you want to complement what you're doing in your ERP for other type of spends, for example, which you don't want to do from your ERP and give a user an easy, user-friendly access, you could use Concur, right? Typically in Concur, the idea is that a request can be created in some minutes, right? All you need to provide is typically the vendor, a description of what you want to buy, an amount and a quantity, and basically it works like a shopping cart, and then you can get an approval flow and raise a purchase order that will be sent to your supplier. So we want to make it simple so that you can approve your spend upfront, and then when you get an invoice, obviously we can look at this purchase order and match against this purchase order to make sure you're paying what you've ordered upfront, or also what you've received. Okay. That's not all, obviously. We spoke about travel, so Concur's background is also very much in travel and expense, because we know about the expenses. We also control upfront the travels. So obviously there's two ways there. You can request approval before you travel on the cost. Before you go on a trip, you can do your search within Concur, get the budget on how much your cost for travel will be in terms of airlines, hotels, car rental, for example, and get this all approved before you travel. The other thing also that Concur has implemented is what we call a trip link. And typically what we've seen in organization is that a lot is controlled on those travel costs, a lot is controlled through your travel management company you're working with. But there are still employees also booking their travel outside the TMC, the travel management company. And typically they would go directly on some websites, Qantas, Virgin, and do their booking. What we're trying to do there is help capture that spend and bring it back into Concur. So you've got visibility on the full spend, even if it's been initiated and ordered outside of your travel management company. So that's why we built this link, and so that you have control there. Right? The last thing I want to mention there is we've spoken about the platform and how we control the travel cost, the expense, the invoice, and how through the purchase request you can pre-approve your spend there. The thing that Concur has built also is an ecosystem around this platform, right? This is not just technology as I described it there. It's also an ecosystem where we've worked with many suppliers to actually connect to our platform, and they are integrated. So here you've got a subset of those suppliers. One that I used again yesterday was Uber, okay? As I travel with Uber, obviously I've configured Uber to use my corporate credit card. So as I mentioned earlier, this corporate credit card, as I spent on it and as it's automatically paying my Uber, this card feed will come into Concur. But what we've done with Uber on top of this is that as a user, I have linked my Uber profile to my Concur profile. And what it does is that the receipt from Uber will directly flow into Concur. So I don't have to worry about taking a picture of my receipt or forwarding the email that I received from Uber to Concur, because it's already there, right? It's the same with the Invoice taxi here in Australia that I use sometimes as well. It works very similar like Uber, and I will get a tax receipt straight into my profile. But it's also we've also partnered with many hotels, for example, or airlines or car rentals like Sixt, all right? As you will book through these companies and you link your profiles, you would get directly an e-receipt into your profile. The other one that I want to mention, TaxBack International. If you're a company where employees are traveling a lot in Europe, for example, or in countries where you will go there, typically, if you have employees traveling to UK, you go there, you spend on a hotel, you will pay 20% tax there, which is VAT, right? These taxes, you can claim it back. Those 20% on a hotel can end up being a huge bill there. You can claim it back for your company, right? The problem is that we've seen is many companies do not go through this process because it's a complex process. You need to collect all your receipts. You need to prepare some forms to actually claim this to the through the local tax authority and so on. So this is complex. And if you travel in many different countries, this becomes a nightmare, right? Taxback International is a partner that sits on top of Concur. Whenever you enable them, what they do is they will analyze your expense data. They will look at those spends that occurred in a country where they can reclaim tax, and they work across more than 40 countries in the world where you can do this. And if there's, so they will get the receipts, they will take care of all the claims back and so on, and they will collect this money for you. And all they do is take a small percentage of these. So if there's nothing to reclaim, there's nothing to pay to them. If there's something to reclaim, they take a percentage. For me, it's a no-brainer, but just keep that in mind that this is a big competitive advantage and differentiator of working with Concur, these Concur apps. Right? Now, what I'll do is jump again on my platform. You remember our scenario where, you know, this cost manager came at the end of November asking me for a report and so on. I went to my accounting system and I had a 50K variance there that potentially I had. So what I'd like to do is go now in a report in Concur. As you understand now, Concur is sitting up front. I'm capturing data as it happens. So if I run my report now and look at my cost projection for November, what I can see here, I've got my budget appearing in red of 420K. Now, if I look at the very top, I've got month approved spend, which was around my 370K. You remember, it's what I had in my ERP as what has been spent so far. And if I look into it, this is typically anything that has been approved. So that could be invoices, that could be non-PO invoices or related to PO, that could be expenses and corporate costs, that could be related to travel undertaken and so on. So I've got all the data there telling me this is what has been approved and already accounted for, and that actually flew already in my ERP, right? Now, if I look at the second part, I've got some committed spend for about 43, 44K. What is that? Well, typically here, I will have another list. I have invoices already received in my organization. They're there. I probably will have to pay them at some point because they've been resent by a supplier. They're not in my accounting system there because they are still in accounting review or pending approval in my organization. I've got also purchase orders that have been sent, but invoice not yet received. And I've got also some expenses that are not accounted yet in my system. So typically coming from a receipt, my employee took a picture of a receipt, or that could come through a credit card, right? So I know about this already, right? I know about that spend, and that's committed. I'll probably have to spend on this, right? But if I only take those two, I'm still within my budget, potentially. But I've got another item, which is my uncommitted spend, all right? And here we're talking about potentially unapproved purchase requests. So here I've got an employee that I've raised a purchase request, not approved yet. Same for travel. I've got employees that have raised requests for travel there. And typically I can see, for example, that this employee, Stephen, is going to travel, and it's going to cost me about $6,000 there for this travel, okay? So now, obviously, you have visibility on every data to make a decision, right? So now, if I was to ask the question again, you know, I'm the AP now, and my this cost manager comes to see me. Well, I'm able to provide a clear indication about the spend there. I'm in full control now. And typically, there's no yes or no, but this manager has everything now to make a decision on what is most important, all right? Maybe, you know, this trip of cost that's going to cost $6,000 into my budget compared to a Christmas lunch of $1,000 with all my team, you know, I can make a decision on what's important there.